So, last stream was absolute disaster. Mm. So we now begin again. So yeah, let's begin. Mm. So, cause I'm redoing this now. So let's go over through the previous part of the stream. So previously we discussed an important thing, right, in this speech. So this is what we are talking about here now is a post from American Renaissance, and this uh, this is the video that talks about how women are rising against Islam in the Western countries. So in this uh, in this video, we will taking a look right at different factors which make the speech right against Islam not that appealing from the perspective of a right wing reactionary person, and we will analyze how the stream has several holes in it. So one of the important things that we pointed out in the previous video was that the woman that is talking in the stream is talking about a sort of society which is collectivist in nature, and she is fed up with individualism because individualism doesn't care about the collective. At the same time, her criticisms of the Western society, right, of the Islamic society, right, revolve solely around Islamic society not providing enough of the human rights, and Islamic society not being as democratic as she would like. But the problem here with this view is that a democratic society that has human rights is kind of anti-collectivistic. So you cannot argue for a collectivistic society and also argue for a society that has democracy and that has human rights, because human rights by the very nature are a sort of resistance against the collective demand of an individual person. So, for example, let's say the collective wants to impose its will on an individual. It cannot if there exists a human right preventing the collective from exercising its will on the individual. If such human rights exist, then there is no space for collectivism in that society. Because for collectivism to be there, it has to be argued that the certain rights of individuals are less important than the right of the collective to exist, right of the collective to prosper, to flourish. So it makes no sense, right? From standing on the podium and criticizing individualism, and at the same time pointing out that Islam is problematic because it does not value human rights, or it does not value individual freedom, or that it does not value democracy. Now we will look at some of the other key aspects. So the aspects would be the same, right? But we will go in more detail and point out how Evola's and Plato's writings are kind of justified, as we see that the West's criticism of Islam is kind of the same criticism of its own Western traditions, ancestral traditions that existed before this kind of era, right? That exists now, before this kind of progressive era. So criticism of Islam from that standpoint, right, is also a criticism of the earlier traditionalist era, which means that any sort of movement back to that period in time is kind of futile. So let's begin, uh, and we'll see what we can find out about this stream.
Not have sufficient means, we make talked about campaigns and actions to spread our warnings, messages, and solutions. Our burkini poster, on which you see a lady wearing a bikini and a burqa at the same time, went viral around the globe. Another successful poster, the leg poster, on which different gradations of Islamization are shown, was prohibited by court because the shoe brand didn't like it.
These two posters are kind of interesting, and we will spend some time on them because they form a sort of anti-Islamic sentiment, right? That is being presented throughout. So the funny thing about these two posters is that while in this whole video up till now we heard about a critique of individualism, a critique of freedom essentially, and a critique of let's say a sort of hedonistic morality. Here we see that all of that falls flat on its face, and that can be easily seen from these two posters. So, one of the interesting things about these posters is that in this poster we see uh, a phrase like a phrase which means I think freedom of Islam, and it is kind of critiquing the freedom that Islam offers. So it tries to show a woman in a bikini in kind of a modeling pose, and that is something to be noted here. And it shows that it is covered in bikini otherwise, sorry, in burqa otherwise. So this combination of bikini plus burqa forms a kind of contradiction that the West sees in the Islamic doctrine, and as such presents it as something that cannot stand in relation with the West and will lead to eventual problems with the Western morality and the Western society as it is construed. The problem with this poster, as we see it right here, is that while it talks about, right, let's say, critiques or presents, let's say, good enough critique of Islam, it does not realize that it critiques itself. The reason why, the reason for that is that if we analyze this poster, one of the things that we see is that the thing that is presented in this poster is kind of sexual, right? And the woman that is presented here, right, is presented in a, let's say, a modeling pose, not a normal pose of a woman going to, let's say, a beach. This is very funny if you analyze it, right? Because one of the important criticisms that feminists had of the, let's say, heteronormative patriarchy was that about the sexualization of women. And there were two groups of feminists, which we know as sex positive feminists and sex negative feminists. So, sex negative feminists was a group of those feminists who believed that any sexualization of women leads itself to sexual stereotypes against women, and that those stereotypes are not preferable, and as such, any sexualization of women is to be avoided, and it actually does not serve the purpose of the woman because the place of the woman is along with the males competing, let's say, in workplace and other avenues. The presentation of women in a sort of sexual space or in sexual mode restricts their presentation to something that is patriarchal, patriarchal and uh, something that is very reminiscent of earlier era complaints that feminists have that women's role in the households was merely as an sexual object and as a baby making machine. On the other hand, sexual positive feminists emphasize the power that women have through their bodies and through sex, and argue that women should use that power in order to gain important positions in the society, in order to get respect, in order to get something in the society, because that is the power that the nature has afforded to the woman. If we compare these two positions, we see a very stark contrast. So we see, for example, sex negative feminists being against prostitution and pornography, but sex positive feminists supporting pornography and prostitution as long as it benefits the woman. Now, the funny thing about all of this is that we know, for example, for the fact that the sexualization of women in the media occurs much more than the sexualization of men, and the reason for those are pretty self-evident because men are mostly the consumers, and because it is far more easy and far more acceptable to sexualize the bodies of the women, and far more biological also. So all of these points culminate into a very strange thing, not very strange, but strange from the perspective of, let's say, any other culture. That we see in the Western societies that women are much more sexualized than men, and most of this sexualization in the West is voluntary. So there is voluntary prostitution, there is voluntary pornography. Now, realizing this, one of the important things that comes to my mind immediately is that the women are performing sexual roles in the society, even in the society in which they are free, predominantly, it will lead to sexual stereotypes against the woman. And that is exactly what is happening. And this develops this sort of Hegelian dialectic in the society with regards to sex positive feminism and sex negative feminism. But that is something that we will discuss perhaps in a future video. What is important to note here, and perhaps that will be most easily visible from the second poster, is that the second poster shows, I think, how Islam will view the women who have bared that much amount of their skin. So while I can't read what is written here exactly, I think I can understand some of the words. I think this means provocative, this means slut, this means hoe, and I'm not sure about this. This obviously means Sharia conform, which means that the full body covering, I think, and this means also something that I don't know. Now, one of the funny things to realize in this poster is whether this poster is considered appropriate, whether this attire is considered appropriate in the Western societies or not, whether this attire is considered appropriate in Islamic societies or not. This poster is kind of sexual, right? Now, what is home? What does home mean, right? From my understanding, home just means a woman who is using her body to gain attention. Uh, in that perspective, is the term that is being used here to critique Islam that much wrong? It is funny because if this poster is not intended to be in sexual light, right? Why does it show a model who has completely waxed legs when women have naturally hair on their legs? Obviously, if the legs were performing the role and the dress were performing the role of mere functionality, then we won't see that. We will see, for example, a woman who is just walking normally. But because the beauty of the legs and the armpits, which is occurring in the feminist circles, is important, we see a sort of affirmation of the Islamic argument that the role of this poster and the role of this dress is not as much, for example, to be a functional dress, but to be something that emphasizes the beauty of the woman. This is something that Jordan Peterson also pointed out, but we'll talk about it as we move on to the next poster, which will make the point more clear. So let's see what she has to say.
it. Of course, of course, this made the poster even more interesting, and it is still very successful on the internet where court cases and courts have no grip. And of course, resilient as we are, we also printed a new version of the poster with
Now, is this sexual? The funny thing is that it shows heels that are so long and perhaps also unhealthy. The role of these heels, and Peterson covered this point, but I will talk about it in a moment, is to emphasize the sexual attributes of women. It is to make the legs of the woman seem appear longer, and it is also to make their butt appear more prominent. And so is the role of the short dress. The funny thing about all of this is that I haven't seen men wearing either heels or short dress. Perhaps they would start wearing it as transgender ideology gets more popular, but I haven't seen that. So this poster, for example, what it represents is merely a very sexual representation of women. From that perspective, if you analyze, right, a model with completely waxed legs, with the heels and with a very short dress, is it not perhaps indicative of the very fact that Muslims talk about, that the goal of the posters like this, perhaps not in this context but in other context, is to depict women sexually? If that is indeed the case, perhaps it is acceptable in the West. But the question about acceptability is kind of a subjective question. The question, perhaps, that is more objective to be dealt here is whether this poster is sexual or not. Dr. Peterson pointed it out. For example, in context of the offices, right, and the workplace, about women wearing makeup and trying to look beautiful. If indeed the goal in the workplace is to work and perhaps not give attention to the woman's beauty, and women gain no advantage of that, women would not do that. The reason why it exists is because the wearing makeup and appearing beautiful gives women a certain edge in the workplace. But that very thing can only exist if a sort of flirty, flirtatious environment exists in the workplace. If such a flirtatious environment does not exist in the workplace, then the makeup would have no power, and women will not work so hard to appear beautiful. So what this points out essentially, right, as a sort of a critique of Islam is acceptability of certain form of sexuality of women in the Western societies. This is something that Islam is kind of against, and this is creating a conflict between the West and the Islam. But the funny thing is that if you look at the previous speech, right, which talks about less amount of hedonism, that does not bond very well with this kind of display. And the funny thing about this is also that while it is true, for example, that this kind of thing would be considered acceptable in perhaps large parts of the Western Europe, they are still treated as sexual, and one can easily find that by searching, for example, the dresses that the Westerners themselves called sexy or sexually appealing. If that is really the case, right? If that is really the case, it is sort of a weird form of traditionalism to associate a sort of something that even the West recognizes as sexual with the sort of traditionalism and use it in the conjunction of a traditionalism come sexual representation of women to critique Islam. This kind of presents a very important distinction between the sort of traditionalism that we see in the West and the sort of traditionalism that we see in the Islamic societies. In the Western societies, there is this form of acceptability of sex, right? Either in the family life or outside of the family life, which we see in the stats which represent the rate of promiscuity and the rate of adultery in the West. If there is promiscuity and there is adultery, there would be perhaps something that the men or the women are finding sexual in each other because there would be no enticement, for example, to have sex with other person if you do not find that person sexual consensually. If that is really the case, then perhaps there are things in the West present itself that are sexual according to the Western mindset also. That is causing an increase, for example, in the rates of adultery and the rates of promiscuity. If those things have to be, let's say, ended, right, and the family has to be strengthened, then the role of these posters is kind of limited. But if only the role of the traditionalism or the newfound traditionalism is to criticize Islam, and it will go away once the Islam leaves the shore of the West, then these kind of posters make perfect sense. And perhaps this is what is the true intention behind the so-called traditionalist movements, which we will see as we move on more clearly. So let's watch.
Yellow shoe soles. We are a group of women with a wide range of trainings and occupations, and when something nauseates us, we come in action. Our actions are different from demonstrations to silent vigils, from dangerous stunts to dress statues with large burqas, to hugging of animals to protest against barbarian halal slaughter, from interviews in glossy magazines to parliamentary work. I'm by training a lawyer, and legislation is, of course, my kind of thing. I'm the architect of Europe's burqa ban. In 2004, I wrote and introduced the burqa ban law in the Belgian Senate, which later on served
So, sorry. So, we are now talking about burqa bans, right? Burqa bans are kind of interesting, right? One of the arguments for the burqa ban is that the burqas hide the what can be said to be the face of the woman and perhaps can lead to terrorists and other actions. But one of the other reasons, perhaps that is the actual reason for the burqa bans, is the burqas uh, have a kind of effect, right? That they are not just merely another form of attire, but they represent a systematic oppression of the woman. In that regards, for example, the women unite to protest against the burqa. But the funny thing about the burqa ban is that burqas are not the only thing, right? If we take a scale that are considered oppressive, for example, the women who are very much against the requirement for them to cover their nipples consider that requirement to be a sort of oppression against the woman because men are not required to do that. Similarly, nudists, for example, would consider any form of clothing requirement that is present in perhaps few Western societies also to be a kind of oppression because that doesn't allow them to wear what they want. The society, for example, places a lot of restrictions on the men and the women in how they choose to dress. Some of these restrictions are have a legal force, some of these restrictions don't have a legal force. However, those restrictions that have legal force are pretty much limited in the West. The restrictions that don't have a legal force are somewhat present in the West also. In either of the case, what we see generally is that while there is an absolute visceral reaction against the burqas, it is not so For the other type of thing, for example, a sort of nudist march, right? A woman being uh, revealing too much. And the reason for that is pretty easy to see. The reason for that is basically because the West's main hatred is against the Puritan culture, and it accepts what could be said to be a perverted culture to a greater extent. So, when we talk about a woman trying to wear that kind of attire, which is very revealing, that is the part of the freedom. But when women are trying to wear burqa, that is kind of oppression. And that is kind of understandable from the Western perspective, because from the Western perspective, any kind of clothing that tries to hide women's beauty is considered oppressive. And that leads us back to the six positive feminist arguments. According to those arguments, because women have this ability to gain importance in the society by use of their sexuality, any attempt to prevent them from showing or using their sexuality is trying to take away rights of the woman, because it will prevent women from several opportunities to have, let's say, a greater power in the society. From that perspective, it kind of makes sense that there is a single minded critique of the burqa, but there's not as much critique of revealing clothing, though the title of this video is Neither Whores Nor Slaves. What is strange in all of this is somehow it is being presented as something traditional, which is kind of nonsense if you ask me. However, when we look at the Islamic mindset and we see that this all of this from the Islamic perspective, what we see immediately is that from the Islamic perspective, all of this seems to culminate in a single important fact, that any sexual representation of women is not acceptable, because that is kind of normalization of sex in the public sphere by the Islamic scholars or the Islamic jurisprudence. Because they are against that, they are against all of this. Now, which is greater or more beneficial for the society is something that perhaps the society will have to decide for itself. But what is perhaps something of an objective fact in this regard is that this acceptance of sexuality is kind of not particularly traditional and is kind of hedonistic. And we see that from a very interesting observation that was pointed out earlier, is that women are represented sexually more often than the males. So it is not just about freedom. And this was just about freedom. We don't see an attachment of sexuality to this freedom. We will just see the freedom in action. But the attachment of sexuality with the freedom suggests perhaps that there is not a single unifying force that is pro, let's say, the freedom of women, but there are several forces that are perhaps working for the freedom of women, specifically in this light. That is kind of an interesting point to observe and has ramifications as we move on from the for the future, which we will talk about shortly.
This burqa ban, I wrote, later on served as a basis for all other burqa bans in other European countries. And I'm very pleased that you liked it, because I'm very proud of it. Actually, all the work which was already done by my organization, Women Against Islam, makes me proud. And as you can see, we did make already a lot of campaigns showing beautiful images in which we warn about Islam. In this area of internet, images are important. But we do try also to spread our messages on a profound way with lots of arguments. In this respect, I wrote a book, Neither Whore Nor Slave, Women and Islam. My book provides not only information about the influence of Islam on the lives of European women, but after each theoretical chapter, ordinary women, mothers and daughters from the most different kinds of walks in life, talk in interviews about their lives and how this was already marked by the Islam and the Islamization.
This is perhaps the most crucial point and will culminate all the points that were talked earlier. Just take a look at the European stats, right? The average number of partners that are considered ideal, an important word to note here is ideal. In the Europe, range from kind of 5 to 10, perhaps even to 12. the Western countries, right, have the greatest rates of promiscuity, and the Western countries have the greatest rates of adultery. I don't see anything else that more or means in the other regards. Perhaps we could apply that also to the men. But if the use of the term whore means anything, it either means an increased amount of sexual activity, it either means, for example, some kind of nudity that is meant to gain the attention of men, or it means, for example, a sort of home wrecking behavior. But because we know that the Western countries have an increased rate of promiscuity, increased rates of partial nudity or nudity, especially in the with respect to the women, voluntarily or involuntarily, and adultery, none of these points actually hold up. The idea that Western women are not whores may be true or may not be true. But what is indeed true is that from the perspective of, let's say, an Islamic or a conservative society, that kind of behavior is kind of whorish. And there's no defense of that, right? The only way that Islam could be critiqued is that if people pretend that that is not true about the West. And that is also the argument that points out why there is a visceral reaction against the burqa. There is a visceral reaction against the burqa is precisely for this reason. Because women feel, for example, that their sexuality is being suppressed. And this is the reason why she talks about beautiful posters, right? Because all of this is about art, looking beautiful, and all of that things, right? In such case, it is kind of a weird sex positive feminism that has combined with right wing to critique Islam. And that makes sense because, from the perspective of a global scale, even the right wing in the Europe is kind of pretty liberal. So it kind of makes sense why the right would align with the sex positive feminists to be against Islamic doctrines. What is surprising in all of this is that people are buying it, and that is what makes it kind of funny. But perhaps that is the nature of the masses, so that is something that is unavoidable. But we move on and we will discuss other points and talk about other things. So yeah, let's.
In the book, I warn for the Islamization of European society. Behind the niqab, behind the bars you see on the cover of the book, behind those bars, you can see me on the cover of the book, actually. And it's a story that I want to tell. What stories are already behind that typical image? And above all, what are the risks of Western women like me to end up on the other half of the book, to end up behind bars, behind the niqab, in the textile jail, actually. In essence, the title of my book is what Islam stands for in respect to women. Women are seen as slaves, or if they don't follow the Islamic rules, they're whores or hookers. According to the Islam, women who do not wear veils are hookers. Women who dress Western are hookers. Women who go swimming in company of men are hookers. In short, everything that we women consider as normal in our Western society is prohibited by Islamic rules for women. Islam does not want whores, but slaves. That's the only role in the Islamic world reserved for women. Women trapped at home, locked in a burqa as incubator to supply fighters for the jihad. That's
The funny thing about all of this is that it was exactly the similar kind of criticism that was used against early Christian society, right? Early traditional society, that women were merely incubation machines, right? Producing babies, and they were barefoot, and they were expected to dress modest. Now, it is something that the West will have to decide for itself, right? Does it agree with the point of the Islam that perhaps the sexual representation of women by the women themselves, but the sexual objectification of women by the women themselves has turned to such an extent that they can call the Western society to be a giant whorehouse, or perhaps that time has not reached yet. From the perspective of the stats, it kind of appears that it has reached that. Just take a look, for example, at any of the content that is being pushed by the media, any of the content that is pushed by the films, Is it not inherently very sexual, and does it not present women in a very specific sexual light? All of this is but accepted by the woman because it allows the woman to gain power. So from the perspective of feminism, it clearly makes sense why women should have the freedom to wear what they want. The real issue comes, and Plato indirectly points it out, and Evola also points it out indirectly, is that all of this is not merely an aspect of freedom. This is also an aspect of controlling a sort of a sexual narrative, right? And this is something that we see everywhere. For example, just take the look at the recent Me Too movement. You would expect that in this age of freed sexual relationships among men and women, a age that has came after the sexual revolution, there would be, in some or the other sense, a greater freedom regarding the sexual matters as well. There would be a greater maturity regarding sexual talks, sexual things, but that is something that we don't see. And one of the great things to look at, to point it out, is the Me Too movement. The Me Too movement points out culture wherein sex is being demonized, sort of demonized. Sexual tendencies of the men are being demonized, and all of this is pretty questionable if the sexual revolution indeed became the point of the West that the West would not let go. Why is that happening? The point of all of that is, as Evola points it out, is that the modern society controls people by the use of sex, and that is what is happening in these cultures. That is why we see, for example, a lot of sexual content that is being pushed on by the media. That is why we see a lot of sexuality, female sexuality in particular, in the public. That is the reason why we see things like miniskirts, micro miniskirts, booty shorts, makeups, low cut tops, and even push up bras, right? The purpose of that is indeed sexual or not, something that the West will have to decide for itself. And currently, West has strangely decided that it is not sexual. But somehow, when it is presented in another light, right? For example, if it is presented in a sort of an environment where the men have to figure out sexual assault, all of that becomes sexual because they will have to punish the creepy guy, the sexual assaulter, for touching something, for perhaps making contact with something that otherwise they themselves would not regard as sexual. This kind of sexual contradiction that persists in the Western society tries to form a synthesis of the sexual thesis and antithesis of the Hegel as present in the Western society, and that is present because of the amount of freedom and the lack of uniformity of standards that is present in the West. We see the aspects of that everywhere. For example, there was this video of Neil deGrasse Tyson, right, who grabbed the arm of a woman, right, and was checking out on the tattoo. That was deemed as sexual, though it is kind of funny because Westerners would criticize Islam for making arms and legs of women sexual. Uh, in their mind, if the arms and the legs of the woman are not sexual, how could Neil deGrasse Tyson commit sexual assault on that woman by grabbing her by the arm? Perhaps it was rude, perhaps it was assault, but it was nowhere sexual assault. The reason why it was considered sexual assault in that particular case is because the heightened what we say scare of the sexual assault has caused and has warped the mind of the West so much that they are fighting against the very thing that they preach, which is regarding women's body not to be sexual but to be something similar to that of males, that is not sexual but functional. But that is something that is kind of proved wrong again and again in the media and in any of the cases that are brought before the court, or are brought into the opinion of the or brought in the court of the opinion of general public. And this is something that we see again and again and again. And perhaps I would do a video about that, covering it in more detail. But something to note here, which is very important, is that if you look at the stats of the Europe, if you look at the way that Europe has functioned and changed from a traditional society to a hedonist society, how is that not something that perhaps Islam would say a verification of its own views? Perhaps relaxed views on sex in the West have led to sexual hedonism. If indeed that is really the case, then Islam's doctrine is verified. If indeed that is really not the case, then the criticism of West being hedonistic by this very same person doesn't make sense. What made West hedonistic in the first place? What made the families of the Western people break down in the first place? What is the reason behind increased rates of adultery and promiscuity in the West in the first place? We will try to look at the answers perhaps she'll give, perhaps she won't give as we move on. So let's watch the video more.
The only role that is played by women in Islamic society. Allah does not like women. These are the first words you'll find in my book. If only it was published in English. Unfortunately, at this moment, it's only for sale in my native language, Dutch, and in German. Dear friends, forced marriages, arranged marriages, headscarves and burqas, oppression and discrimination of women, polygamy, pedophilia, targeting of pubescent girls from other communities, female genital mutilation, but also the ritual slaughter of animals. These are all the hate crimes that we Europeans must undergo at this moment. It is time to reject the absurd idea that it is intolerant to name, criticize, and oppose such evils. It is time to stop renunciation of our own identity. Time to stop capitulating to multiculturalism. We need to wake up, pay attention, and take action to defend the foundations which made us what we are and which we were once built a world empire, our classical Roman and Greek heritage, Christianity, humanism, and enlightenment. It is possible to turn the tide, and there is hope. In France, Germany, Holland, England, Italy, Hungary, and other European countries, right-wing patriotic parties like my party, Vlaams Belang, are very successful in elections. Now it is time to return to the path of strong, self-confident, identitarian Europe. This is a great task, an historical challenge which our generation is both challenged and privileged to rise to meet. It is the crusade of our times, to which we must dedicate our lives, following the example of so many of the best of our ancestors. Awareness, militancy, and clarity of purpose are the keys to winning this fight for a future for Europe and our children. Thank you.
And this is perhaps something that I was pointing out right from the very beginning. All of this mask of traditionalism is just adopted to drive out Islam. Take a look, for example, of the Western states without uh, presence of Islam. In the UK, around half of the homes would be fatherless. There is a large epidemic of suicides, and there are a lot of divorces. There are less number of marriages. There is more adultery, as we talked about. There is more promiscuity, and all of that is not beneficial for the children. So it is kind of funny to talk about children when, even if we take away Islam from the equation, people are not really thinking about the children. It is not that Islam is the enemy of the children in the West. It is that the Western conditions themselves are an enemy for the strong families. And this is something that is missed from this type of debates. There is important point to that history tells us, right? Whenever we try to look at the societies that decayed, that were destroyed by invaders or by economic collapse, right? Any type of group. What happens in that case is the social decadence, which is the main reason behind the breaking down of society into individualistic and atomic units, is not as much criticized as the attack by the invaders. But the fight for the resources, fight for the land, and fight for the power and status has always been a sort of aspirational dream of men. It was aspirational dream of women also. This is the reason why the feminism existed. This is the reason why sex positive feminism existed in the first place. So all of that does not make sense. The Muslims are, for example, coming here and trying to implement their worldview. They are doing it because They want the power to be in their hands. If the Western people want the power to be in their hands, they are also fighting for the same thing, power and status. Because power and status is what makes life better, at least in some materialistic sense. If that is indeed really the case, then it becomes easier to criticize the invaders and not criticize the internal conditions that lead to the condition of invasion in the first place. If Islam, let's say, when it goes out, this very moment, leaves the West, if every Muslim refugee goes back, the similar conditions that have persisted in the Western nations would persist for another half or a full century. They won't go away as they were not going away just 5 years before, when there were not these many strong nationalist movements. And the very fact that these movements are largely nationalistic and not traditionalistic shows that the main goal behind these movements is the protection of white identity or the European identity or the national identity. As and when Islam goes away, the movement towards the similar kind of liberalism as we have seen before would begin. So this is not actually the fight for the right wing. This is actually the fight of the liberals against Islam, and it should be termed as such. There is nothing right wing, for example, in protecting a society that is kind of nudist, that is kind of promiscuous, that is kind of adulterous. It goes against everything of the order and everything that the right has argued for. So it's kind of strange way to put it that it is a right-wing movement. It it is right-wing only in the sense that the people are using the right because the left wants globalization to pursue their own interests, which is protection of a liberal culture, which is the protection of a progressive culture. And even if Islam goes away, that culture will destroy itself because that culture does not have in itself that principles that could override the antithesis that is attacking the culture constantly. If Muslims are not causing hashtag #MeToo movement, Muslims are not creating division between men and women, Muslims are not spreading degeneracy in the West, they are not sharing porn in the West. What sort of traditional objective, if any traditional person has, would be fulfilled by driving out Muslims? The answer is there is none. The traditionalist person can fight Muslims for the protection of other things that perhaps would relate to other views that he holds. But if he is indeed trying to preserve traditionalism, then kicking away Muslims is perhaps the last thing that he would want. And this is the sort of division that is occurring in the nationalist and the traditionalist movements. As we see from the history, and as we see and analyze the fall of the society, we see three types of what can be said to be schisms in the right wing. On one hand, we have this kind of nationalistic identitarian right. On the other hand, we have a sort of traditionalist right. And the third right that we have is the men-based right. The schism in these three kinds of the rights, right? The separation of these three kinds of the right wing spells a doom for the future. And it is something that cannot be avoided. Because the largest threat that perhaps is emerging for the West is not Islam. It is communism. It is leftism. It is perhaps a very increased form of extreme form of liberalism. But that perhaps is put under the rug to fight of Islam because Islam represents a kind of masculine threat. Because Islam is not that manipulative, but the liberalism, the leftism, and the communism are kind of more manipulative, so they escape under the radar. And the position that the right has taken, or the supposed right has taken, is actually self undermining because kicking away Islam because it is not conducive to feminism or women's rights or gays' rights or transgenders' rights kind of defeats right's own points, right? And kind of cements the culture war that the left has already won. And this will be the exactly this and this exactly will be the thing that will cause the downfall of the West. This is not something that could be avoided by human intervention. This is ordained by the time. It is not that people who were in those societies that were also decaying in the past were not trying to think exactly like the people here are thinking. They would also be upset by what in their mind would be the barbarians would be bringing to their culture. But the reason why they could not prevent that is exactly the reason that is at the play here. Because their own position is kind of contradictory in itself. And that is exactly the major failure of the supposed right wing that has come onto the scene. It will only sustain itself based on a threat. And that when that threat goes away, then the right itself will fall. And when it will fall so hard that the left or the liberal hegemony will cement itself as something that realizes that becomes the very moderate, that becomes the epitome of the moderate position. And in such way, even the views that the right holds now that are not considered fringe would be considered fringe, leading to an overall loss of the right wing. But that is how the politics goes. So it's kind of unavoidable. And we will see hints of that as we move on and discuss a few more important points as we end this video.
What is the barrier to getting your book published in English?
Um, huh, the most important barrier for publishing it in English are financial issues. And because we need to sell it, of course, in Europe we all have different languages. We can only sell it on the English market, so we do not have access to the United States yet, and this is why we did not publish it yet in English. But Mr. De Winter's book has been published in all kinds of European languages, French, Spanish, German, and so on. Also in English, but we are still, my book is not as long published as the ones of Mr. De Winter, so we are still trying to get it published in English.
If low birth rate is the problem of Europe, what are the women of Europe doing to up it?
Yes, the problem is in Europe, I speak a lot with women about having more children. Every time someone speaks about their children to me, I say, how many children you have? Why don't you have more children? Everybody answers me, we want more children. The problem is that in Europe, the living standard is so expensive that we need to go out working, both men and women. And our party has a proposition to have more and better family policy, which means that women or men, it can be one of them, the dad or the mother, can stay at home when children are little and get a fee, an employment fee for taking care of own children. Because
And this is something that is most funny, right? She literally criticizes Islam for thinking of women as baby making machines. And this is exactly the same thing she's advocating. She's asking women why you don't have more children. And the second funny thing about all of this is that if you look at her policy is that she will take away money from the taxes and give it to the families who want to have more children. So it means more tax burden on the taxpayer. This is exactly the sort of what we see as traditionalist game, right? This tax burden would obviously fall on the men. This is another reason why there would be sort of schism between the men part of the right wing movement and the traditionalist part of the right wing movement, because this sort of pseudo traditionalism that gives handouts to the woman who wants to have family, right, who wants to have children, puts the burden on the men essentially, and tries again to take away resources from them to serve its own cause, while criticizing Islam for doing exactly the same thing. This is what makes it all funny. Islam is authoritarian, but they are being authoritarian by pushing their taxes onto the males to satisfy the workings of their own ideology. Islam thinks of women as baby making machines, same thing that they are doing, but somehow Islam is the bad guy and they are the good ones. This is what makes all of this funny, and the reason why in their mind they are justified to do all of this is because it is temporary. And the moment Islam goes away, all of this facade would go away as well. So this is not traditionalist. This is a kind of quasi, or rather pseudo traditionalism that has embarked on a journey in a society that is threatened by invaders. which is something that all societies try to do when they are threatened by an external force, that they adopt a sort of pseudo right wing to protect their society. Otherwise, they don't care and vote for every leftist or liberal policy in the world, in the universe, in the bag. That is what makes all of this so funny.
It's very important that if parents do want to take care of their own children and do not want to put their children in daycare centers, it's better that a parent, a father or a mother takes care of its own child because they understand each other much better than that someone else is taking care of your child. And the other families, the traditional political parties do not want this because they do not want children, they don't want to put the investment, the financial, the finances with these kind of systems because they do want the children to go to daycare centers and to schools because then they have their grip on the children. And we see that in our schools. In our schools, they get the multiculturalism and the ideas of the traditional left-wing parties within their lessons. My children go to school, and often I radiate the names of the kids who are mentioned in the books because those names are already names which come from other cultures. Like Mohammed
Increasing the speed,
is doing something in the book,
kind of
and I
boring.
radiate the name Mohammed. But these are the little things by which they have a grip on our children, and children come home and they say, but it's normal that Mohammed lives among us, and it's something they do through school already. So left-wing traditional parties, they don't care much for helping people or helping mothers and fathers to take care of their own children. And if that were possible, and if you could have a living standard, I think many mothers and many fathers would prefer to have more children than they do now at the moment.
Has your organization branched out?
Uh, Also notice an important fact, right? The Muslims that are coming in the West are having children. They don't care about the living standards. The living standard excuse is so bad. It simply doesn't work because the Muslims that are coming in the West, they are also facing the same prices of the products that a person in the Western society who is native to the West is facing. So if he can have the children, why the West cannot have the children? Strange, right?
Into the United States and receive support from other women in America who recognize that we are going to be facing these things that you're facing?
We do not have connections in the United States yet. There was some interest from the United States, but we're mainly an organization which is concentrated in Europe. The organization Cities Against Islam is an organization in which also men are involved, and Mr. De Winter is the president of the Cities Against Islam organization, and we have a structure in Europe. We are working together with the women also. We work together with France, with Austria. We have many women in parliament who are elected in those other European countries, and we work together with them, but we do not yet have connections with people or organizations in the United States.
Has your government ever tried to charge you with a crime or put you in jail for your activities?
Yes, I have been for court 2 times. The most intrusive court case was the one in which they tried to abolish by court case our political party. Our political party, which was established in 1978, had to come before court. It used to be named Vlaams Blok, and we were in court. Then the court decided that we were not violating the racism law. Then the state went into appeal. Then we were convicted. Then we went to the higher court. It's called Court of Cassation. They go over if the rules are implemented correctly. This court gave us rights, so we had to go back, get a new trial. Then the prime minister, he declared, we will keep on getting them before court and keep on doing trials until they are punished, until they get radiated. Then they indeed found in a different kind of city in Ghent, for more specifically, a court who condemned us. The Vlaams Blok, the political party, was condemned for racism, but we restarted the new party, which is called Vlaams Belang, and ever since they are saying that they are doing or collecting items to have a new court case, but not yet. We were not yet in court with Vlaams Belang. Although we are not afraid of court cases because we are supported by the people, and the people vote for us. When we were convicted the first time when Vlaams Blok was convicted, in 2004, we had the highest outcome of an election ever. So we were pleaded free by the people, which makes it even more difficult for the establishment to do it again because they make the people aware of the fact that the democratic system is not respected. So we are not afraid of court cases at all, but we have been in court, yes.
That's very interesting that you've also been charged. I understand that Geert Wilders and his party have been brought before the courts, Marine Le Pen, among others. And you mentioned militancy towards the end of your talk. Now, obviously, a peaceful resolution, a democratic resolution would be preferable at all. But do you think there's any possibility that some type of militant action, civil war in essence, could be forced upon us if the authorities continue to prosecute valid political parties that represent our interests?
Can you repeat, because my English is not so
Okay. With the governments prosecuting parties like yours and others throughout Europe, and therefore denying people the right of representation, do you think that this can be resolved peacefully in the defense of Europe, or do you think there's a possibility it might take more than that?
Well, our people vote for us, the Vlaams Belang. And what happens after the elections is that no traditional party, no party of the system wants to govern with us. Because it's like in the kitchen. We want a new recipe for the cake. We don't want a piece of the cake. We want to change the system, so the system reacts on us and doesn't want to get in the kitchen with us. This means that the people who voted for us are very, very angry and become more and more angry. At the last elections, they were cheated on by a political party, NVA, who said that they would do the same as we would do if we were not in the cordon sanitaire, but they didn't. So now people are coming again in polls. We are rising in the polls again on democratical way. This is a peaceful way, and people are still believing in the elections in democracy. But we also see, and especially after the violent attacks of Paris and Brussels, we also see that there are men, young men, who become very angry, who want to defend their women. And after what happened in Colonia, many men said, we will never let that happen again to our girls and women. So they become more and more, there's an uprising, but we as politicians, we do not want an uprising. Of course, we want the change.
And this is the sort of schism I'm talking about, right? So there are three blocks in the right, and there are three perspectives of analyzing the right. And this is the most important point of the video, because in this point, I will try to analyze what Plato and Evola said about the workings of the society. So the right can be put in three parts, right? One of them is called religious right, or quasi-religious right. So a quasi-religious right is that part of the right that gains its principles in the polity from the right wing, from the religion that they belong to, and because though the values of that religion correspond to the right more often, they subscribe to the right wing ideology. Secondly, there is this sort of right wing that is based on the right wing metaphysics, right? On the right wing metapolity. So what happens is that certain people have that mindset that is very conducive to the right and that is not conducive to the left. And those people, because the right appeals to them more, vote for the right wing. And the main reason behind them voting for the right is not a sort of a religious motive, but a motive because the right appeals to them more. The third part of the right is a right that is consequentialist right. The consequentialist right stands with the right wing when it sees the benefit of standing up with the right wing. And this is the right wing that we are talking about right here now. A large amount of men uh, who naturally have a tendency to protect their women uh, see these attacks by the invaders as an attack on themselves, and they are adopting the right wing position to defend those women. They might be right wing, they might not be right wing, but they are adopting the right wing position because that is more beneficial for their cause. Such a form of right wing, basically, is not a principled right wing. It is, by definition, consequentialist right wing. So it stays right wing only up to the point that the threat that they perceive to be in the society for which, because of which they vote the right, but stays in the society. When, as and when that threat gets removed, these people perhaps would again start voting more of centrist in nature. Will start voting centrist or leftist even, or perhaps even liberal. So this sort of adoption of right-wing principles is not what is happening at the core. What is happening at the core is that there is an adoption of a right-wing favored consequences, and that is because the left is against their own interests. Now, this relationship works to a great extent, but there are times when there would be schism in the movement, and the three groups would separate. So there would be a separation of, let's say, family oriented consequentialist people. There will be a separation of the traditionalist people, and there will be a separation of normal men. Those are the men who will carry the right wing torch further because men are generally more disposed to the right wing ideology because that is how their thinking works. Biologically, men are more likely to vote for the right, and women are more likely to vote for a more liberal or leftist form of government. So the schism would be men versus traditionalists versus nationalists, and that schism will play out in the future. That schism will have important consequences for the future. Evola talked about or hinted about this very early, right? He talked about how conservatives, for example, play a very great role in making progressives more strong because they prevent the society from getting from facing the effects of their own policies. Because conservatives prevent the society from facing the costs of it implementing its own policies, they actually become a useful tool for the progressives. The role of the reactionary in all of this is not a quasi-religious role. It is also not a consequentialist role. It is the role of a principled person who is standing against the modern world and revolting essentially and riding the tiger. Those people will actually dictate the right-wing thesis for the next century. And the right-wing thesis for the next century will not neither be dictated by the quasi-religious parties or quasi or consequentialist parties. It will be dictated by the principalist parties, and we will see what that thesis would be as we move on further into the future. But that thesis will surely be different than either the ethno-nationalist thesis or the traditionalist thesis.
System to change the recipe on a democratic way. And it's very important for politicians, as Mr. De Winter and myself, to channel the sentiments of anger into the democratical system, into a peaceful way. But as Mr. De Winter yesterday also told, we are on the verge of a civil war, and it can happen anytime. People are getting very, very angry. And you see also by more and more people going to the shooting range clubs, learning again how to handle weapons. We have a massive we have a system which we cannot, it's completely different from the United States. We cannot have guns in Europe. We do not have military learning for young men. It was abolished. So the young men do not know what weapons are about. And they go by themselves now to clubs. And the club system is exploding with members. But we do not want, of course, that there's a civil war. But you feel the tensions rising, unfortunately.
Regarding the litigation that was against the Vlaams Bloc, I believe you said one of the courts held the party guilty of racism. Was that based on a plank or position of the Vlaams Bloc, or was it because of things that people did, and was it official policy? Could you elaborate on that a little bit? What specifically was the racist point?
Well, the complaint was a thick book like this with A4 papers. Actually, what they did is everything that was ever published by the Vlaams Blok, what was ever said by especially Mr. De Winter or other leaders of the party, or my speeches, all sentences were looked at with a big mirror glasses, and they were all put together in this thick book, and that was the evidence of us being racist. But what we said were just the facts, true facts about immigrants. For example, we talked already a long time about people who are in jail in our country. They are from foreign origin, and we want data about it. We collected ourselves data about where the people origins, where they come from originally, who are currently in jail or at the time when the court case was made. And we're not supposed to say that. We are not supposed to point out the ethnic groups of the people who are in jail, for example. This was one of the little details in a book like this of the complaint that was made against us.
So it is officially over, and perhaps now we can talk about the actual theory. So all of this was presented for the main reason of presenting the theory. There's something that Plato talked about, right? And it is from at least 2 millennia before. So he talked about a sort of aristocratic society. And then that aristocratic society degenerates into a form of, you can say, democracy, right? And that democracy then degenerates into the form of oligarchy. And that oligarchy degenerates into the form of democracy. And then that democracy degenerates into a form of tyranny. So how does that happen? Well, Plato gives reasons for it. One of the reasons that he gives, for example, for this transformation of societies is the presence of certain things in the societies which Hegel would call antithesis. For example, in the aristocratic societies, people are selfless. and they are not pursuing, let's say, power for the for their own appeasement or for themselves to become great, but in the democratic society, the advent of democratic society takes place when the people who realize that they are contributing to the society much more than the others perhaps want the greatness associated with that contribution. The society then becomes ruled by sort of warriors. But even the warriors themselves face large kinds of hardships, and the power then transfers from the people who do not want to die in the wars or do not want to face the wars, but who want to enjoy the riches of the society. Thus, the oligarchs become the ideal for the society, the people who have the money. Because the people who have the money use that money in fulfillment of their desires, hedonism spreads. And that hedonism is something that every person wants. And this results in the formation of a democracy where every person wants the piece of the pie. Because every person wants the piece of the pie, democracy itself becomes leftist and will continue to become leftist more and more as the time proceeds because the masses which are unable to earn that level of profit for their own enjoyment, to pursue their own enjoyments and pleasures, will now want to extract that from the oligarchs by means of the voting power that they possess. And as such, the leftism dominates. This is the point in the time that communism becomes strong, and we have seen that in the 20th century. So, but why does democracy change into tyranny? This is perhaps the most important thesis in the work of the Plato. The reason why democracy changes into a tyranny is because the presence of large amount of hedonistic desires lead to the loss of standards, and the people without standards cannot decide what is right and what is wrong. So they need a strong person to fill that vacuum. They need a strong person to tell them what is right and what is wrong. The reason, however, for the election of the strong person and the subsequent transformation of that person into an evil person is because of the very presence of hedonism into the society. The people try to present the movement of the society from the democracy to the tyranny as a movement from hedonism to the principles, but it is actually the movement from the hedonism to the protection of that hedonistic society by invoking principles that are beneficial to the people in preservation of the democratic, or let's say the societal structure. That is exactly the same thing that is happening here, and it will eventually lead to tyranny. Now, whether that tyranny would be good or bad is something that we will have to see into the future, because tyranny is kind of different from the perspective of different people. Some people would perhaps like that kind of tyranny in which they will have power or their values will be pushed the foremost, pushed to the foremost, and certain people will not like that tyranny. Perhaps mm, most of the people will hate that tyranny, but we don't know what kind of tyranny would that be. What we know exactly is that the tyranny could only be avoided if there were consistent principles already established in the society, but they are not. So the society will have to go through the phase of tyranny before it goes again through the phase of aristocracy. And that is something that we are seeing in the Western Europe. And that is very evident from the speech itself. For example, there's a talk about human rights, as you pointed out earlier, which does not jive itself with the collectivism, which does not jive with the collectivism. There's a talk about freedom, there's a talk about the ability to pursue hedonistic interests, but that itself does not jive against the jive with the criticism of hedonism that we saw earlier. We see that there is a push for women to make more and more babies, but that is exactly the same thing that is being criticized, that Islam is being criticized for. We see that there is a mandate that is developing which argues that there should be a burden on the people to pay for the families. There is an added and extra tax burden. That tax burden would obviously be authoritarian because that tax burden is being pursued for the fulfillment of one's own ideology. That, however, itself is not a concern, though the people themselves are concerned that Islam is authoritarian and that is the reason why it needs to be prevented from getting a hold into the society. It is not clear whether this sort of traditionalism that has been developed supports sexualization of women or does not support sexualization of women, supports the modesty of women or does not support the modesty of women. Realizes that The Western society itself is on the brink of sexual immorality, but does not realize that. It is not entirely clear. The title says that women are neither whores or slaves, but the data does not lead to that conclusion. The posters are definitely kind of sexual, right? But they still somehow are supportive of a kind of a traditionalist mindset, which is kind of strange. All of these contradictions will catch on with the West and are catching on with the West. For example, there is a large question about how and where the transgender ideology gained its roots from. The funny thing about all of this is this, right? It is true, for example, that in the Western society, there's large amount of sexuality. There's large amount of display of sexuality. There are advertisements that try to sell you a product based on your sexual instincts, right? By presenting it as something related to sex, so that it captures your attention more. There are games, there is media that tries to present or tries to essentially shows sex down your throats, and all of this is because uh, there is a view that by attaching something to say with the sex, people can make more money, and that is something that is partly true. But because of all of that, the society has taken a completely sexual route. Now, where transgenders come into this picture, right? When we see that this kind of distinction, when we see that this kind of movement of the society that is being made from its traditionalist past to a more sexual oriented past that has been captured by some authors, there is a sort of flashback at these kind of criticisms by pretending that all of this that sexual material is not inherently sexual but functional. And we see that again and again, where at the same time of presenting women bodies as sexual, we try to present people, for example, who view women bodies as sexual as being degenerate or perverted, which makes no sense at all. Because how can these two ideals be compromised with each other? Because they are directly in contradiction with each other. Because of that, while it is true that equality of men and women is stressed at all times, the distinction between men and women is growing more than ever before. And Dr. Peterson points it out. If we take, for example, if we do a study of the societies, we find that the societies that try to pretend that they are most equal have the most amount of inequality. Because once given freedom, men and women pursue their interests, and that itself develops a kind of distinction between the roles of men and women, and kinds of itself presents a large inequality that cannot be bridged. Because men and women are different, they pursue those different interests, leading to a massive difference in how men and women are perceived. And because this difference exists between how men and women are perceived, but it is tried to be hidden by talking about equality all day long. For the people who are confused with all this mayhem, think that the only way that they can, if they have any tendencies that belong to other gender, be satisfied in their own lives is by transitioning. And we see that in the cases of transgenders, for example, men who become women and gain body parts of the woman, try to flaunt them as much as possible. Or we see women who turn into men, chop off their breasts, and other kind of things. And the reason for that is that these people have those tendencies that they perceive to be of the other gender or the other sex, but they cannot try to argue in the society which says that everyone is equal to pursue cannot try to pursue them rationally, because the mindset of the society, of the thesis of the society, is of that of equality, though the antithesis itself points out that that distinction that they are seeking after, that they are seeking, is actually true and existent in the society. So the only way that they have is transition, and this is something that they do. By transitioning, they are able to pretend a garb of equality, but act unequal and act as their tendencies make them act. For example, if the men feel that they have tendencies of women, some kind of tendencies, girlish tendencies, then by transitioning, they are able to act like women without questioning the egalitarian principle. If women feel that they have boyish tendencies, by transitioning, they can act like men without being without challenging the egalitarian principle. And that egalitarian principle, which is presented as a sort of a virtue, is not followed by the people in the West and is kind of hollow. And we saw that from the Tucker's rant, right? Tucker Carlson's rant, where he talked about in a leaked audio how women cannot gain uh, important places in career if they are not beautiful. And the reason for that statement is that for making that statement is that statement is actually true. Women are still judged on their looks, and that will happen regardless of whatever the society people are living in, because that is something biological. But that is something that is hidden by the egalitarian principle, which tries to present it that men and women are equal and they both are judged on the basis of merit. But that is not true. And to realize that, you will have to realize one thing only. If you take a look at, for example, the professions that are most beneficial for women in terms of monetary payments and in terms of making them famous, you will find that a woman can get more famous by becoming a porn star than by becoming a person, by becoming a sportswoman. A woman can become more famous by becoming an e-girl than by becoming a, let's say, lesser known politician. Though acting in porn or acting on Twitch like an e-girl is actually a lot easier than becoming a sportswoman or becoming a politician. The tendencies, the primal tendencies persist, the same tendencies that that persist in the Islamic societies. Just because they are hidden, the West can act as if it is granting equality to men and women, but that is not really the case. And any sort of criticism that is pointed out by using this fact is quickly shut down by bringing out the egalitarian principle. And that egalitarian principle, that talk of the principle of men and women being equal all the time, is like actually resulting in the transgender ideology. Because if men and women are actually equal, there's nothing wrong in a man transitioning into a woman or a woman transitioning into a man. There's nothing wrong in men being acting girly or women acting manly. It is somehow, by a very strange and weird principle, West is attacking its own values and its own societies and completely destroying it. And it is placing the blame on the elites or the other cultures. But those cultures or those elites are not the reason. And the reason uh, for all of that lies in the masses itself, as Plato put it. The masses have a sort of moral sentiments and sort of hedonistic sentiments, right? And in pursuit of that, they are willing to away any form of truth, sacrifice any notion of what is actually good, and that is the main force behind the destruction of West. And uh, making Islam go away will not take that away. In all, that thing will be left in the basket of the West for as long as the Western society does not completely self-destruct. And as it was self-destructing beforehand, by there being increasing conflict among men and women, among people of different races and or ethnicities, or in people of different religion, even removing religion and different ethnicity to prevent that conflict will not take away the primal principle of a war, of the masculine principle being against the feminine principle. And as long as that war continues, there is literally no solution, and no solution will be achievable. The war between the masculine principle and the feminine principle will result in the victory of the masculine principle by establishment of a tyranny that will quickly transform into an aristocracy, but not without causing a lot of pain. And that is a pain that is unavoidable. And that is the pain the West is moving towards with great speed. And perhaps some of that pain is kind of deserving, because the very principle that the West has adopted leads to that pain, and such make the pain unavoidable and a natural consequences of the West's own decisions, for which nobody else is to be blamed or can be blamed. As we see the movement of the West, we perhaps will see those schisms in action. When those schisms happen among the left will go strong and use its power to establish a sort of a leftist orientation of the society along with a sort of traditionalistic orientation. That mixed leftist plus traditionalist orientation will lead to the failure of the society, because that combination is kind of deadly, because it locks down the society into a place in which, while the Hegelian synthesis appears to be complete, it is directly in conflict with the main principle, that is the principle of there being consistent standard in the society. Marxism, by its very nature, is not very pro-traditionalism, and traditionalism by its very nature is not very pro-Marxism, because Marxism is against any form of hierarchy, at least in principle, and traditionalism is very pro-hierarchy, at least in principles, at least in principle. And because hierarchy is what makes the society, any conflict about the hierarchy will lead to the eventual doom of the society, and that is something that the West will have to get an answer to. And I don't think that answer is available now, and I don't think that answer will be available in the near future. That answer will only be available when there is a sort of pseudo right that has established itself as the mainstream right would face utter defeat from the hands of the actual right. But because that right would be actually reactionary, that will change the face of the society as it exists forever. So yeah, this is the principle. This is the Dionysian principle. And if people want to read about that principle, they can read it in the works of Evola, especially The Revolt Against the Modern World, where Evola tries to explain briefly what the Dionysian principle is, along with the Apollonian principle. That is a good read. And reading that, one immediately realizes, right, that all of this that is happening in the society is not against the norm, right? It is not a form of reactionary politics that is against the father time, that is turning the society into more and more progressive hellhole. It is actually the very same thing. By excluding the Muslims, by excluding the regressives from the society, the progressive arc would be completed. And the only way to move away from that progressive arc would be by the installation of a proto-dictator. That dictator would complete the Platonian cycle and will lead to uh, the Platonian end. And that Platonian end is something that we all know about, which is changing the face of the society, changing the structures, changing the culture, and changing the workings of the society forever. As one cycle completely completes and the new cycle starts, the previous cycle, along with its values, is completely discarded. What that discarding would entail, perhaps the religion, perhaps the cultural values, perhaps the traditional values, is something that we will see in the future. But we will see it shortly, and perhaps then it will be more easy to understand the Platonian principle and the work of Julius Evola. That's all. Perhaps I will do a video explaining that principle in more detail and use excerpt from this video as the points as examples to explain that principle better. But that will be something that will come in the future. As for now, this video has ended. I hope that you enjoyed and learned something about the principle that was in the question here, and how the movement of the society is expected from the perspective of a reactionary trained in the philosophy of Evola and Plato. So future is not looking pretty good. It's kind of black-pilled, but that is the nature of the world, so not a big deal, right? Okay, let's end this stream. I will perhaps post addendums to this video in the future, and I will link them, so that won't be a problem. So yeah, let's end this stream. Bye.